Chapter 1. The fluorescent lights of the Vane Enterprises executive parking garage flickered with a rhythmic, dying hum. For Arthur Vane, it was the only sound that matched the throbbing behind his temples. It was 11:42 p.m. He had spent the last 14 hours dismantling a hostile takeover bid and firing a CFO who thought creative accounting was a valid business strategy. Arthur adjusted his silk tie, his movements sharp and impatient. He just wanted a glass of neat scotch and a bed that didn't involve a laptop. "Sir, your car is..." His driver, Miller, never finished the sentence. A black SUV screeched around the concrete pillar, blocking Arthur's silver Maybach. Arthur didn't panic. Panic was for people who didn't have ironclad insurance policies and a direct line to the police commissioner. He simply crossed his arms over his tailored charcoal suit and waited. "If this is a protest about the downtown redevelopment project, you're trespassing," he said, his voice a cool, practiced rasp. Four men in tactical gear erupted from the SUV. They didn't look like protesters. They looked like professional problems. "Julian Vane?" The lead man barked, his face obscured by a balaclava. Arthur stiffened. Julian, his twin brother, the soft-hearted, disaster-prone accountant who probably couldn't even spell money laundering, let alone survive whatever these thugs had planned. "You've made a significant error in judgment," Arthur said, stepping forward. He was taller than his brother, broader in the shoulders, and carried a lethal aura that Julian completely lacked. But in the dim, flickering light of the garage, with his glasses tucked into his pocket, the resemblance was a curse. "Shut it, Jules. Boss wants you alive." But he didn't say anything about unbruised. Before Arthur could reach for the concealed alarm in his cufflink, a heavy blunt object connected with the back of his skull. The world tilted. The cold concrete rushed up to meet him, and as the darkness swarmed his vision, Arthur's last conscious thought wasn't fear. It was pure, unadulterated fury. "When I wake up," he thought as he felt himself being hauled into the back of the van like a sack of grain, "I am going to fire every single person in my security department. And then I'm going to ruin whoever owns this SUV." The transition back to consciousness was marked by the smell of damp earth and expensive cigars, a jarring combination. Arthur's head throbbed with a rhythmic $120 BPM. He was zip-tied to a heavy wooden chair in a room that smelled of mildew and old blood. He didn't struggle. Struggling was inefficient. Instead, he took a mental inventory. Pulse. Elevated, but steady. Restraints. Industrial grade, likely nylon. Environment. Low-rent basement. Substandard lighting. Poor climate control. A heavy steel door creaked open at the top of a set of wooden stairs. Thudding footsteps followed. The gait of a man who owned the ground he walked on. A man stepped into the pool of light. He was dressed in a dark, open-collared shirt that revealed the sprawling ink of a crow's wing climbing up his throat. He was handsome in the way a landslide is handsome, destructive, and inevitable. This was Killian, the butcher Moretti, though Arthur didn't have a name for the face yet. Killian leaned against a support beam, lit a cigarette, and looked down at his prize. "Well, Julian," Killian drawled, blowing a cloud of smoke toward the ceiling, "you've caused me a lot of trouble for a man who spends his days looking at spreadsheets. Where's the ledger?" Arthur raised his head. His eyes, usually a calm flint gray, were now burning like liquid mercury. He didn't look like a terrified accountant. He looked like a man who was about to give a very poor performance review. "First," Arthur said, his voice dripping with icy condescension, "my name is Arthur. Second, your kidnapping technique is amateurish. You left a trail of tire marks in a monitored garage that my team has already geofenced. And third," Arthur leaned forward as much as the zip ties allowed, his gaze pinning the Mafia Don to the spot, "I don't know what a ledger is, but I do know that you are currently costing me $42,000 per hour in lost productivity. I suggest you unbind me before the bill becomes something even your associates can't afford to pay." Killian froze. The cigarette ash fell onto his polished leather shoes. He squinted, leaning in closer to Arthur's face. The man in the chair didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. "You want Julian," Killian whispered, the realization hitting him like a cold drench of water. "I'm the one who pays Julian's rent," Arthur snapped. "Now, get me a coffee. Black. 2 sugars. We have a lot to discuss regarding your impending legal liabilities." Chapter 2. Killian Moretti had stared down federal prosecutors, rival cartels, and an assassin with a wire garrote. None of them had ever looked at him with the blistering, disappointed parent energy currently radiating from the man in the wooden chair. "Coffee," Arthur repeated, his voice clipping each syllable like a falling guillotine. "I won't tell you again." Killian took a slow, deliberate drag of his cigarette, trying to regain his footing. He was the butcher. He operated out of a warehouse that had seen more blood than a trauma ward. Yet, standing over this man who was bound, bruised, and rumpled, Killian felt like he was the one being interrogated. "You've got a lot of nerve for a guy whose life currently depends on my mood," Killian growled, stepping into Arthur's personal space. He flicked the ash onto the floor, mere inches from Arthur's pristine leather Oxfords. "You're Arthur Vane, the CEO, the Ice King of the Fortune 500. And you're a man who clearly hasn't looked at a ventilation blueprint in 20 years, Arthur countered, his eyes scanning the ceiling. "There is black mold in that corner, and your humidity levels are destroying my suit. This is a $6,000 charcoal wool blend, Mr. Moretti." Killian Moretti. "Well, Mr. Moretti, if you're going to kidnap me, at least provide a climate-controlled environment. It's basic hospitality." Killian laughed, a low, dangerous sound. He pulled a serrated combat knife from his belt and leaned in until the cold steel pressed against Arthur's jawline. "I didn't bring you here for hospitality. I brought your brother here because he has a ledger containing the offshore accounts of the Volkov family. Since you're the smart twin, why don't you tell me where he hid it?" Arthur didn't pull away from the blade. If anything, he leaned into it, his pulse visible but steady against the metal. "Julian is an accountant, Mr. Moretti. He likely thought the ledger was a gift for his scrapbooking hobby. He doesn't have it because I took it from him 3 days ago for safekeeping after I saw a black SUV following him." Killian's eyes sharpened. "So you have it?" "I have a digitized, encrypted version of it stored on a server that requires a biometric handshake every 6 hours." Arthur lied with the practiced ease of a man who handled billion-dollar mergers. "If I don't check in by 8 a.m., the server wipes itself and sends a GPS ping of this location to the FBI, the SEC, and my personal head of security, who, I might add, is a former Mossad operative with a very short temper." Killian pulled the knife back, his jaw tightening. He looked at his watch. It was 1:15 a.m. "You're bluffing," Killian said, though a seed of doubt had planted itself in his gut. "Am I?" Arthur raised an eyebrow. "Check my pockets." Inner left. Killian reached into Arthur's jacket, his fingers brushing against the warm silk lining. He pulled out a sleek, titanium-cased smartphone. The screen was locked, but a notification was pulsing in blood-red text. "System lockdown in 6 hours, 44 minutes, and 12 seconds. "Now," Arthur said, his tone shifting from icy to business transactional. "We can continue this theatrical display of violence, or we can discuss a settlement. You want the Volkovs gone. I want my brother safe and my Monday morning back. Our interests are aligned." Killian paced a small circle of light, his boots crunching on the grid. He should just kill him. He should find Julian and beat the information out of him. But looking at Arthur Vane, sitting there like he was at the head of a mahogany boardroom table instead of a torture chair, Killian felt a perverse sense of fascination. "What kind of settlement?" Killian asked, leaning against the table. "You will move me to a room with a bed, a shower, and high-speed Wi-Fi," Arthur commanded. "You will provide a secure line so I can delegate my morning meetings. In exchange, I will analyze the ledger and give you the specific routing numbers you need to bankrupt the Volkovs without firing a single bullet. Information is a much more effective weapon than that. Letter opener you're carrying. Killian looked at his knife, then back at the CEO. You're trying to hostile take over my kidnapping. I'm optimizing it, Arthur corrected. Now, about that coffee. If it's instant, don't even bother bringing it in. Killian stared at him for a long beat, then turned to the heavy steel door. Marco, he barked. A hulking man with a broken nose appeared. Yeah, boss. Get him out of the chair. Put him in the upstairs suite. Lock the doors. Put 2 men on the landing. Killian paused, looking back at Arthur, who was already inspecting a smudge on his sleeve, and find a French press. The good beans. From the Colombian shipment. Arthur nodded curtly. Sensible. We'll start the briefing at dawn. Don't be late. I despised tardiness. As Arthur was let out, Killian stayed in the dark basement, smelling the lingering scent of expensive cologne and ozone. He realized 2 things simultaneously. He had the wrong man, and he was absolutely, terrifyingly attracted to him. Chapter 3. The upstairs suite was a drafty room in a converted warehouse that Killian clearly thought was luxurious because it had a rug and a private bathroom. To Arthur, it was a structural liability. By 3:15 a.m., Arthur had showered, used a Guess toothbrush with visible disdain, and draped his damp dress shirt over a radiator. He was currently sitting at a scarred oak desk, staring at 2 of Killian's men, Marco and a nervous younger man named Leo, who was standing guard inside the door. You, Arthur said, pointing a silver pen he'd found in the desk at Marco. The perimeter rotation. It's predictable. I've heard the boots on the gravel every 20 minutes on the dot. A blind toddler with a slingshot could timing gap your security. Marco blinked, his hand twitching toward his holster. I'm supposed to watch you, not take advice on patrol routes. You're doing neither effectively, Arthur snapped. He stood up, pacing the room in his undershirt and slacks, looking less like a captive and more like a drill sergeant. And you, Leo, you've been leaning against that door frame for 20 minutes. Your posture is compressing your lumbar spine, and your reaction time is currently 80 seconds slower than it should be. Sit down or stand straight. Leo straightened up instantly. Sorry, sir. Don't apologize. Optimize. The door swung open, and Killian stepped in, carrying a steaming French press and 2 ceramic mugs. He stopped, taking in the scene, his 2 best enforcers looking like scolded schoolboys, while Arthur Vane dictated best practices for guard duty. I leave you alone for 2 hours, and you're already trying to unionize my men? Killian asked, setting the tray on the desk. Your men are an insurance nightmare, Moretti, Arthur said, eyeing the coffee. He poured a cup, sniffed it, and gave a begrudging nod of approval. The Colombian shipment, I presume? The best, Killian said, sitting on the edge of the desk, his tattooed neck inches from Arthur's face. Now, the ledger. I want names. I want the accounts the Volkovs used to pay off the port authorities. Arthur took a sip of coffee, the caffeine hitting his system like a lightning strike. In due time. First, we need to discuss your overhead. You're overpaying for your protection rackets in the East End by at least $15 per cent dollar. Your collectors are skimming, and your intimidation tactics are outdated. Fear is a depreciating asset, Killian. Loyalty through shared profit margins is a growth industry. Killian leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. I'm a Mafia Don, Arthur, not a venture capitalist. In this economy, you're both, Arthur countered. He reached out, his fingers surprisingly steady as he straightened Killian's collar. The Volkovs aren't just your rivals. They're your competition, and I specialize in hostile acquisitions. If you want to dismantle them, you don't burn their warehouses. You buy their debt, freeze their liquid assets, and let their own men tear them apart for a paycheck. Killian stared at Arthur. He'd expected a CEO to beg for mercy or offer $1 billion bribe. He hadn't expected a man who looked at a criminal empire and saw a poorly managed startup. "You're insane," Killian breathed. "I'm efficient," Arthur corrected. "Now, give me your laptop. I need to bypass the Volkov's firewall, and I refuse to do it on a device that still has solitaire in the taskbar." Killian signaled Marco and Leo to leave. Once the door clicked shut, the air in the room changed. The professional bravado remained, but the space between them felt charged with something thick and heavy. "If you try to ping your security team while you're on that laptop," Killian warned, his hand resting on Arthur's shoulder, "I'll have to remind you why they call me the Butcher." Arthur looked at the hand on his shoulder lodge, scarred and surprisingly warm, then back at Killian. A small, terrifyingly sharp smirk touched his lips. "Mr. Moretti, if I wanted to leave, I would have convinced your guards to drive me home an hour ago. For now, you're the most interesting investment I've seen all fiscal year." Killian felt a jolt of something that wasn't anger. He pulled his laptop from his bag and slid it across the desk. "Show me then. Show me how a CEO kills a Russian mob." Arthur sat down, cracked his knuckles, and began to type. "Watch and learn, Killian, and keep the coffee coming. This is going to be a very expensive morning." Chapter 4. At 6:30 a.m., the rising sun bled through the grime of the warehouse windows, illuminating a scene that would have baffled any federal agent. Arthur was leaning back in his chair, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, pointing at a line of code on the laptop screen. Killian was hovering over his shoulder, his chin nearly resting on Arthur's collarbone, watching a series of offshore bank balances drain in real time. "There," Arthur said, his voice husky from caffeine and lack of sleep. "I've rerouted their payroll into a dormant charity account for retired circus animals. By noon, the Volkov soldiers will realize their direct deposits didn't hit. By 2 p.m., they'll start looking for someone to shoot. By 4 p.m., they'll realize they can't afford the bullets." Killian stared at the screen, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face. "You're a terrifying man, Arthur Vane. I'm a man who hates inefficiency. Now, about my—" Arthur was cut off by the frantic buzzing of the burner phone on the desk. Killian snatched it up. "Boss," Marco's voice crackled through the speaker, sounding uncharacteristically panicked. "We have a problem at the perimeter. A guy just pulled up in a beat-up Prius. He's crying, and he's holding a Tupperware container." Arthur's eyes widened. "Oh, for heaven's sake. Who is it?" Killian barked. "He says he's Julian Vane," Marco replied. "And he says he's here to turn himself in because he heard his brother got kidnapped, and he brought, lemon bars as a peace offering?" Killian looked at Arthur. Arthur looked at the ceiling, rubbing his temples. "Bring him up," Killian ordered, his voice flat. 5 minutes later, the door burst open. Julian Vane stumbled in, looking like a disheveled golden retriever. He was wearing a sweater vest, his glasses were crooked, and he was indeed clutching a plastic container. He saw Arthur and let out a sob of relief. "Artie, I'm so sorry. I told him it was my fault. I have the ledger, well. I have the USB drive I thought was the ledger, but it might just be my tax returns from 2019. Julian stopped dead when he saw Killian. "Oh, you must be the Butcher. You're—" much more symmetrical than the rumors suggested. Killian looked from the trembling, earnest Julian to the icy, lethal Arthur. The physical resemblance was uncanny, but the energy was night and day. It was like looking at a wolf and a poodle in identical coats. "So," Killian said, crossing his arms and looking at Arthur, "this is the target, the man I was supposed to spend the night breaking. He cries during insurance commercials." "Killian," Arthur said dryly, standing up and straightening his crumpled vest, "you would have broken him in 30 seconds, and then you'd be stuck with a weeping accountant who can't stop talking about his sourdough starter. I, however, have just saved you a 3-month turf war." Julian looked between them, his eyes darting to the way Killian was standing, unnecessarily close to his brother. "Wait, Artie, are you consulting for the Mafia?" I'm optimizing them, Julian. There's a difference. Killian walked over to Julian, looming over him. Julian squeaked and held out the lemon bars like a shield. Killian took one, bit into it, and nodded. Not bad. A bit tart. I use extra zest, Julian whispered. Killian turned back to Arthur, his eyes dark and unreadable. The deal was that I let you go once I had what I needed. I have the accounts. I have the target. You're free to leave. The room went silent. Arthur looked at the door, then at his brother, then finally at Killian. He should have been thrilled. He had a board meeting in 3 hours. He had a life to get back to. But the thought of leaving this chaotic, dangerous man to run his empire with predictable patrol routes and mediocre tech felt strangely like a personal failure. Or perhaps he just didn't want the night to end. Julian, Arthur said, his voice commanding. Take the Prius. Go to my penthouse. Lock the door. Do not answer it unless the person knows the password is diversification. But what about you? Julian asked, clutching his Tupperware. Arthur looked at Killian, a challenge in his eyes. Mr. Moretti and I have a few more logistical details to iron out. It seems his security protocol is still dangerously substandard. I'll be home for dinner. Probably. Killian's eyebrows shot up. A slow, dangerous smirk tugged at his lips. You heard the man, Julian. The CEO is staying. He's got a lot of restructuring left to do. As Julian scurried out, confused but relieved, Killian stepped closer to Arthur, trapping him against the desk. You're staying for the security audit? Or are you staying for the coffee? Arthur reached up, his fingers brushing the crow's wing tattoo on Killian's neck. The coffee was adequate. Your company, however, has potential for high growth. I'd like to see the ROI on a second night. Chapter 5. By noon, Arthur Vane had officially staged a bloodless coup. He hadn't used a gun, and he hadn't used a knife. He had used a color-coded label maker he'd forced Marco to buy from an office supply store at 8 a.m. The guest suite, which Killian previously thought was a peak example of bachelor chic, was currently being dismantled. Arthur had stripped the polyester sheets, opened every window to vent the smell of gunpowder and cheap cologne, and was now standing in the middle of the room with his laptop, directing 2 of Killian's most feared hitmen as they moved a heavy mahogany armoire. 3 inches to the left, Leo. Symmetry is the foundation of a disciplined mind, Arthur commanded. Killian walked into the room, stopping dead as he nearly tripped over a stack of out and in trays. He looked at his men, who were sweating and looking significantly more terrified of Arthur's disapproval than they ever were of Killian's wrath. What is happening? Killian asked, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous register that usually signaled someone was about to lose a finger. Your floor plan was chaotic, Killian. It reflected a disorganized psyche, Arthur said, without looking up from his screen. He was now wearing one of Killian's black silk shirts, the sleeves rolled up, the top 3 buttons undone because his own suit was being professionally dry cleaned by a contact Killian didn't know he had. I've moved the tactical monitors to the north wall. It reduces glare and increases reaction time by $12 per dollar. Also, I fired your caterer. Killian's eyes narrowed. You fired my Arthur. You are a guest. A guest who is technically still under the umbrella of a kidnapping. The caterer was serving processed meats and sodium-heavy starches. Your men are sluggish because their glycemic indices are a disaster, Arthur countered, finally looking up. His gray eyes caught the light, sharp and predatory. I've put in an order for organic greens, lean proteins, and a high-end espresso machine. I expect the invoice to be settled by your slush fund in the Cayman Islands. I've already accessed it, by the way. Your password was Butcher123. Embarrassing. Killian felt a vein throb in his temple. He stepped closer, crowding Arthur against the newly positioned armoire. He smelled like expensive soap and the hint of the forest-scent candle he'd somehow convinced a guard to light. You're playing a very dangerous game, Vane, Killian whispered, his hand coming up to grip the wood beside Arthur's head. Most people run when I open the door. You're rearranging my furniture and auditing my Black Ops accounts. Arthur didn't flinch. He leaned in, his nose nearly brushing Killian's. Most people are boring, Killian. They fear the unknown. I simply see a business that is underperforming and feel a compulsion to fix it. Besides, his gaze dropped to Killian's mouth for a fraction of a second. You haven't actually tried to stop me. Killian's grip on the wardrobe tightened. He wanted to be angry, but the sheer audacity of the man was intoxicating. It was like trying to cage a storm and having the storm tell you your cage is the wrong shade of gray. The Volkovs are panicking, Killian said, his voice husky. Their accounts are frozen and they're starting to blame each other. You did that with a keyboard in 4 hours. My men think you're a wizard. I think you're a menace. I'm a partner, Arthur corrected softly. If you want to keep the city, you need more than just muscle. You need a ghost in the machine. I can be that ghost. But I require a certain standard of living. The moment was broken by a loud thud from downstairs. Boss! Marco shouted from the hallway. The organic kale delivery is here. And there's a guy in a suit at the gate saying he's Mr. Vane's personal tailor, and he's here for a fitting? Killian looked at Arthur, who just checked his watch. 10 minutes early. Excellent. Efficiency is spreading. Killian let out a frustrated, breathless laugh and stepped back. Fine, you want to stay? Stay. But if I see one more label on my weapons locker, I'm locking you in the basement again. The weapons locker is next, Killian, Arthur called out as Killian walked toward the door. It's currently organized by caliber. It should be organized by mission profile. We'll discuss it over the kale salad. Killian slammed the door, but he was smiling. He was officially the only Mafia Don in history whose hostage was currently managing his life better than he was. Chapter 6. The warehouse's main floor, usually a chaotic mess of weapon crates and half-eaten takeout, had undergone a Vane-style intervention. Arthur had commandeered a mahogany table from the back office, draped it in a bolt of black industrial silk he'd found in storage, and dimmed the harsh overhead shop lights until the room felt less like a hideout and more like a private club in Manhattan. Killian entered, having traded his tactical vest for a clean, open-collar black shirt. He stopped dead, eyeing the table. There were 2 crystal tumblers, a bottle of high-end scotch Arthur had insisted be retrieved from his penthouse, and 2 plates of seared salmon with wilted greens. I'm a Mafia Don, Arthur, Killian said, his voice echoing in the rafters. I don't usually do candlelit unless I'm about to burn a building down. Sit down, Killian. Your blood sugar is plummeting, which explains your irritability, Arthur said, not looking up from his tablet. He looked disturbingly comfortable in one of Killian's spare silk shirts, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that were surprisingly lean and toned. We have 3 hours before the Volkovs realize their offshore accounts have been emptied into a blind trust. We might as well dine like civilized predators. Killian sat, picking up a silver fork with the suspicion of a man expecting a trap. He took a bite of the salmon. His eyebrows shot up. Where did you get this? My men can barely boil water. I coached Leo through the searing process via the intercom, Arthur replied, finally setting his tablet aside. He has potential, though his seasoning technique is timid. Much like your business model. Killian leaned back, swirling the scotch in his glass. The amber light caught the sharp, dangerous lines of his face. My business model has kept me alive and at the top of the food chain for a decade. What's your critique, Ice King? It's unsustainable, Arthur said, leaning forward. You rely on fear, which is a depreciating asset. Once someone isn't afraid of you anymore, you have nothing. But if you provide infrastructure, if you become the person the city needs to function, you become untouchable. You want me to be a utility company with guns? I want you to be a partner, Arthur corrected. Vane Enterprises needs a physical security arm that isn't bound by the slow gears of the legal system. And you need a way to spend your money without the IRS wondering why a waste management consultant owns 3 Ferraris. The room grew quiet, save for the hum of the warehouse generators. Killian's gaze dropped to Arthur's mouth, then back to his eyes. The tension that had been simmering since the kidnapping, a volatile mix of irritation and professional respect, suddenly shifted into something much more predatory. "You're very bold for a man who's still technically my prisoner," Killian murmured, standing up. He walked around the table, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He stopped behind Arthur's chair, his hands coming down to rest on Arthur's shoulders. Arthur didn't tense. He leaned back into the touch, his gray eyes meeting Killian's in the reflection of a nearby window. "I stopped being your prisoner the moment I saved your payroll, Killian. Now, I'm an investment. The question is, do you have the courage to finalize the merger?" Killian leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of Arthur's ear. The scent of wood smoke and expensive scotch hung between them. "I've never been good at paperwork, Arthur. I prefer a hands-on approach." He turned Arthur's chair around with a sudden forceful jerk. Arthur looked up at him, his expression cool, but his pulse was visible, a rapid, rhythmic beat at the base of his throat. Killian reached down, his fingers tangling in Arthur's hair, tilting his head back. "The Ice King wants to play in the dirt?" "I want to see if the butcher is as sharp as his reputation suggests," Arthur challenged, his voice a low, commanding rasp. Killian didn't give him a verbal answer. He bent down and crushed his lips against Arthur's. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision of egos, a desperate, heated negotiation between 2 men who were used to being the most dangerous person in any room. Arthur met the heat with equal ferocity, his hands gripping Killian's forearms, pulling him closer until there was no space left for logic or business. The diplomacy was over. The takeover had begun. Chapter 7. The warehouse was suddenly bathed in the rhythmic, jarring pulse of red and blue lights. Outside, the distorted megaphone bark of a police negotiator cut through the night. "This is the SCPD. We have the building surrounded. Release Arthur Vane immediately." Killian's men were scrambling. Marco sprinted past the dining room door, racking a submachine gun. "Boss, they've got snipers on the roof of the cannery across the street." Killian looked at Arthur, his expression hardening back into the cold mask of the butcher. He didn't point his gun at Arthur. He didn't have to, but the distance between them felt like a chasm again. "Your Mossad guy's early," Killian said, his voice a low growl. "I guess the partners' meeting is adjourned." Arthur didn't move. He sat at the table, his hands still resting near the crystal tumbler. "If you open fire, you're dead. If they storm this room, your life imprisoned. And I lose my most promising project. I don't surrender, Arthur." "I'm not asking you to surrender," Arthur said, standing up. He looked out the window at the tactical teams stacking up against the perimeter fence. "I'm asking you to let me handle the negotiation. My head of security, David, is a man of logic. He doesn't want a bloodbath. He wants me back on the 9 a.m. conference call." Killian stepped toward him, grabbing Arthur's arm not to hurt him, but to hold him in place. "If you walk out that door, you're a victim. I'm a criminal. There is no Moretti Holdings after the FBI gets a statement from the Ice King." Arthur reached out, his fingers tightening on Killian's tactical vest. "Then I won't give them a statement. I'm going to go out there and tell them this was a high-stakes, off-site corporate retreat for crisis management training. I'll tell them I hired you." Killian stared at him, incredulous. "You're going to tell the police you hired the Moretti family to kidnap you?" "I've sold stranger things to shareholders, Killian. Now, put the gun in the small of your back. Marco, tell the men to drop their weapons and start, I don't know, picking up trash? Look like contractors." Arthur didn't wait for an answer. He smoothed his borrowed silk shirt, adjusted his cuffs, and walked toward the heavy steel front door. Killian followed, his hand hovering near his hidden weapon, his heart hammering a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. Arthur pushed the door open. Spotlights instantly blinded them. "Hands up! Put your hands up!" Arthur Vane didn't put his hands up. He stepped into the light, squinting slightly, and checked his watch. "David, you're 6 minutes behind the scheduled extraction time. I'll be deducting that from your quarterly bonus." A tall, granite-faced man in a tactical vest stepped forward, lowering his rifle. "Arthur, sir? We tracked your biometric handshake to this location. We were informed of a kidnapping." "A kidnapping?" Arthur let out a short, dry laugh that sounded perfectly bored. "It was a stress test simulation, David. I needed to see how the Vane Enterprises executive security handled a deep-cover extraction. And frankly, I'm disappointed. It took you 7 hours to find a warehouse with substandard insulation." He gestured vaguely behind him to Killian, who was standing in the shadows, looking like he was 1 second away from a massacre. "This is Mr. Moretti. His firm specializes in unconventional security audits. We were just finishing the debrief over dinner." The police officers looked at each other, confused. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. David looked at Killian, his eyes narrowing. He knew a killer when he saw one. He also knew Arthur Vane never lied, unless it was for a profit. "Sir," David said slowly, "the report came from your brother. He was hysterical. Julian is a creative soul. He overreacts to everything," Arthur said, stepping toward the police line. "Now, dismiss the SWAT team. It's an embarrassment to the city's budget. Mr. Moretti and I have a final contract to sign." Arthur turned back to Killian. In the glare of the police lights, their eyes met. It was a silent pact. Arthur was giving him his freedom, but in exchange, Killian was now officially under the Vane umbrella. "I'll see you in my office tomorrow at 10, Moretti," Arthur said loudly for the benefit of the body cams. "Don't be late. We have a lot of restructuring to do." Killian gave a slow, mocking tip of his head. "I wouldn't miss it for the world, boss." As Arthur was ushered into the back of a black sedan, David leaned into the window. "Sir, who is that man, really?" Arthur looked out at the warehouse where Killian was watching him go. "That man, David, is my new chief of physical security. And if you ever lose my trail again, he's the one I'll send to find you." Chapter 8. Vane Enterprises was a monolith of glass and steel that screamed order. At 9:55 a.m., the lobby was a hive of quiet, expensive activity. Then the revolving doors pushed open, and Killian Moretti walked in. He wasn't wearing a tactical vest. Arthur had sent a courier to his warehouse at 7 a.m. with a garment bag containing a bespoke midnight blue suit and a note that simply said, "Don't embarrass me." Killian looked like a wolf in a tuxedo. The crow's wing tattoo peeked out from his crisp white collar, and his presence was so disruptive that the receptionists actually stopped typing. He bypassed the security desk, ignoring the visitor badge, and headed straight for the private elevator. When the doors opened on the 50th floor, he found Arthur standing by a floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city as if he owned the air itself. "You're 5 minutes early," Arthur said, his reflection in the glass watching Killian approach. "I suppose my lecture on tardiness made an impression." "The suit fits," Killian said, stepping up behind him. The scent of Arthur's expensive cologne was already familiar. "But I feel like I'm wearing a straitjacket. Why am I here, Arthur?" "We both know that simulation story won't hold up if the Volkovs start talking. The Volkovs are currently being audited by the IRS, the D, and a very persistent group of animal rights activists who want to know why their payroll went to a circus charity." Arthur turned, his expression unreadable. "They are too busy drowning in paperwork to talk to anyone." Arthur walked to his desk and slid a heavy folder across the mahogany surface. "This is your new life. You are now the CEO of Moretti Shield, a subsidiary of Vane Enterprises. You provide high-risk asset protection. Your men, Marco, Leo, and the others are being enrolled in a 3-week certification course today. If they fail, they're fired." Killian laughed, a harsh sound in the sterile office. "You're serious? You're turning my family into a corporate department." "I'm turning your family into a legitimate power," Arthur corrected. He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "In the basement, you asked me what I wanted. I want an edge that isn't found in a boardroom. I want the butcher, but I want him sharp enough to cut through the red tape that holds me back." Killian reached out, his hand trailing over the edge of Arthur's desk before snatching the man's tie and pulling him forward. The desk was the only thing between them. "And what do I get? Besides a fancy title and a suit that costs more than my first car?" "You get the Ice King," Arthur whispered, his breath hitching as Killian's thumb brushed his jaw. "And all the resources that come with him." The intercom buzzed, shattering the tension. "Sir, your brother is here. He says it's an emergency involving a lemon bar franchise?" Arthur sighed, closing his eyes for a second. "Send him in." Julian burst in, looking remarkably refreshed compared to the night before. "Artie, I had an idea. If we take the Volkov's laundromat locations and turn them into—" He stopped, seeing Killian. "Oh, Mr. Butcher, you look much less like a murderer in navy blue." "It's Moretti now, Julian," Killian said, releasing Arthur's tie but keeping his eyes on the CEO. "I'm the new head of security." "Oh, wonderful," Julian beamed. "Artie, does this mean we're all friends now? Because I've invited the Volkov's former bookkeeper over for tea to discuss their filing errors, and he seems very nervous." Arthur looked at Killian. Killian looked at Arthur. "We have a problem," Arthur muttered. "I'll get the car," Killian replied, his predatory instinct clicking back into place. "And Julian? Stop inviting mobsters to tea." But he brought scones, Julian called out as the two men strode toward the elevator. Chapter 9. The grand atrium was a cathedral of glass, champagne, and people who hid their knives behind smiles. The annual Founders Gala was the crown jewel of the city's social calendar, and for Arthur Vane, it was a battlefield. Arthur adjusted his cufflinks, his tuxedo fitted with such precision it looked like armor. Beside him, Killian was a dark shadow. The navy suit from the office had been traded for a black, all-black tuxedo that made him look like a lethal secret. "The earpiece is irritating," Killian muttered, leaning close to Arthur as they ascended the marble staircase. "I'm pretty sure the guy by the fountain is carrying a Beretta under his dinner jacket." "That's the Undersecretary of Defense, Killian. He's supposed to be armed," Arthur murmured back, nodding gracefully to a passing socialite. "Stay focused. Our target is Viktor Volkov's cousin, Mikhail. He's the one who didn't get the memo that the family business is currently a charity for circus animals. I still don't see why I couldn't just take him to a basement," Killian grumbled. "Because in this room, a ruined reputation is more permanent than a shallow grave," Arthur said, stopping near the balcony. He turned to Killian, his gray eyes softening just a fraction. "And because I want to see if you can handle a ballroom as well as you handle a warehouse." Killian scanned the room. His gaze wasn't that of a guest. It was that of a predator marking exits. "You're testing me, Ice King. I'm showcasing you. There's a difference." The music shifted to a slow, sweeping waltz. Arthur held out a hand, a daring glint in his eyes. "Dance with me." Killian froze. "I don't dance. I break bones." "It's the same principle. Weight distribution and following a lead," Arthur said, his voice a low challenge. "Or are you afraid the butcher can't keep tempo?" Killian took the hand. It was a statement. In a room full of the city's elite, the most powerful CEO was taking the floor with a man who looked like he'd been carved from midnight. As they moved, the world around them blurred. Killian's hand was heavy and warm on Arthur's waist. They didn't talk about business or ledgers. For the first time, the power struggle felt balanced. "You're a good dancer," Arthur whispered, his head leaning toward Killian's shoulder. "I'm just making sure no one gets a clean shot at your back," Killian replied, but his grip tightened affectionately. The moment of peace was shattered by the crackle of Arthur's earpiece. It was David, positioned in the security van outside. "Sir, we have a breach." 3 men in waiter uniforms just bypassed the kitchen sensors. "They're headed for the balcony. They aren't looking for Mikhail. They're looking for you." Killian felt the shift in Arthur's posture before the CEO even spoke. "How many?" Killian asked, his voice instantly dropping the bodyguard act. "6 total, boss." Marco's voice cut in over the private channel. "They've got silenced subcompacts. They're Volkov loyalists. They're going for a martyr play." "Arthur," Killian said, his eyes scanning the upper tier. "The dance is over." "Wait," Arthur said, his mind racing. "If we run, the guests panic. If there's a shootout in the Grand Atrium, Vane Enterprises stock drops 30 points by Monday. Screw the stock price." Killian growled, stepping in front of Arthur as he saw a flash of steel near the champagne tower. "Get behind me, now." But Arthur didn't hide. He reached into the small of his back where Killian had taught him to conceal a compact secondary weapon just 2 days prior. "We do this quietly," Arthur said, his face a mask of cold determination. "Lead them toward the gallery. No witnesses, no headlines." Killian looked at the CEO, the man he had kidnapped, the man who was currently prioritizing a market valuation over his own life, and felt a surge of terrifying pride. "Fine," Killian smirked, drawing his own weapon with a fluid, invisible motion. "Let's show them how we handle a merger." Chapter 10. The transition from the velvet-lined ballroom to the cold, echoing silence of the North Gallery was seamless. Arthur led the way, his stride confident, while Killian moved like a shadow in his wake, his weapon low and ready. "In here," Arthur whispered, ducking into the 19th century wing. The only light came from the moon reflecting off the gilded frames of landscape paintings. A floorboard creaked behind them. Killian didn't hesitate. He spun, grabbed a heavy bronze bust of a long-dead philosopher from a pedestal, and hurled it into the darkness. A grunt of pain followed, then the muffled thwip-thwip of a silenced pistol hitting the wall where Killian's head had been a second before. "Go." "The service elevator," Killian commanded. They burst into the back hallway just as 2 more waiters rounded the corner. Arthur didn't wait for Killian to do all the work. He stepped into a firing stance Killian had corrected only 48 hours ago and squeezed the trigger of his compact. The shot took the lead gunman in the shoulder, spinning him around. "Not bad, Ice King," Killian grunted, catching a second gunman with a brutal knee to the solar plexus before finishing him with a precise strike to the temple. "But your grip is still too tight. Relax the wrists." "Criticism noted," Arthur panted, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Now, can we leave?" "My car is armored." "Your car is a target," Killian said, grabbing Arthur's hand and dragging him toward a nondescript side exit. "Marco, bring the bike to the alley. Now." 10 minutes later, Arthur Vane, billionaire CEO, was clinging to the leather jacket of a Mafia Don as a Ducati roared through the city's industrial district. The wind whipped at Arthur's tuxedo, and for the first time in his life, he didn't care about the optics. He felt alive. The safe house was a loft Killian kept under a false name, a Stark. Concrete space filled with high-end tech and a very large bed. No labels, no organic kale, no subordinates. Killian kicked the door shut and engaged the deadbolts. The adrenaline was still thick in the air. He turned to Arthur, his face flushed, eyes dark with the thrill of the hunt. "You took a shot," Killian said, tossing his jacket onto a chair. "A real live-fire shot. Most CEOs would have been under the table crying for their lawyers." Arthur leaned against the brick wall, his chest heaving. He began to unbutton his tuxedo jacket, his movements slow and deliberate. "I told you, Killian. I'm a predator. I just usually use different teeth." Killian stepped into his space, his hands landing on the wall on either side of Arthur's head. The bodyguard mask was gone. The boss mask was gone. The Volkovs are done. After tonight, the board will want your head for the simulation story, and the streets will want mine for turning corporate. Let them want, Arthur whispered. He reached up, his fingers sliding into Killian's hair, pulling him down. I've spent my life being what people needed me to be. Tonight, I just want to be the man who hijacked the kidnapping. The kiss was desperate, fueled by the lingering scent of gunpowder and the shared knowledge that they were both, for the first time, truly out of control. Killian lifted Arthur onto the kitchen island, his hands gripping Arthur's thighs as if he were afraid the CEO would vanish into the night. I'm going to ruin you, Arthur, Killian muttered against his throat. Don't worry, Arthur replied, his voice a sharp, breathy command. I've already factored the risk into the budget. Chapter 11. The morning sun hit the concrete floor of the loft with merciless clarity. Arthur woke to the sound of a distant siren and the unfamiliar weight of a heavy arm draped across his chest. For a moment, the Ice King didn't exist. There was only the warmth of the man beside him and the quiet hum of a city that didn't know its power structure had shifted overnight. Arthur sat up, his hair disheveled, a sight that would have sent his PR team into a collective panic. Killian was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at a burner phone with a look that could have curdled milk. The board is calling, Killian said, his voice a low rasp. And Julian has left you 16 voicemails about a security breach at your penthouse that turned out to be a malfunctioning smart fridge. Arthur reached for his shirt, regaining his composure with every button he fastened. The reality of the situation is setting in. Last night was a tactical success, but a strategic nightmare. We can't hide in the loft forever. It's worse than that, Killian said, standing up. He handed the phone to Arthur. It was a grainy photo of the two of them on the Ducati, taken from a high-angle street cam. It hadn't been leaked to the press yet, but it had been sent to Killian's private server with a single caption. The butcher has a leash. Marco? Arthur asked, his eyes narrowing. Marco, Killian confirmed, his jaw tight. He's been with me 10 years. He thinks you've turned me soft. He thinks a Mafia Don shouldn't be playing bodyguard for a man who uses words like synergy without irony. The air in the room chilled. This wasn't a corporate takeover. This was a mutiny. In Killian's world, a leader who was perceived as compromised was a leader who was marked for replacement. He's going to move, Arthur said, his mind already calculating the variables. He knows our location, he knows our assets, and he likely knows where Julian is being held for safety. He won't go for me, Killian said, grabbing his holster. He knows he can't beat me in a fair fight. He'll go for the leverage. Arthur's phone buzzed in his hand. It wasn't a voicemail. It was a live video feed from his penthouse security system. The screen showed the front door being kicked in, not by the Volkovs, but by men in Moretti shield uniforms. Julian appeared on screen, clutching a rolling pin and looking genuinely offended. Excuse me, we are in the middle of a sourdough fermentation cycle. Then the feed went black. He has my brother, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a temperature that would have frozen the sun. He didn't scream. He didn't panic. He simply looked at Killian with a lethal, focused clarity. Your second-in-command just made a very poor investment. Killian checked his magazines, his eyes reflecting a cold, murderous intent. Marco wants a war. Fine, but he forgot one thing. What's that? He's playing a game against a Don, Killian said, heading for the door, and a CEO who doesn't believe in losing. We're going to bankrupt him, Arthur. Permanently. Chapter 12. The headquarters of Moretti Shield was a refurbished steel mill on the edge of the docks, the very place Arthur had spent the last week optimizing. Now, those optimizations were working against them. The high-definition thermal cameras Arthur had installed were currently tracking their approach, and the encrypted biometric locks were keyed to Marco's new acting director clearance. The irony isn't lost on me, Killian muttered as they crouched behind a stack of shipping containers 200 yards from the entrance. He checked the action on his rifle. You built a fortress, and now we have to break into it. I didn't just build a fortress, Killian. I built a backdoor Arthur replied. He was sitting on a rusted crate, his laptop balanced on his knees, his fingers flying across the keys. Every piece of software Vane Enterprises touches has a maintenance override. I'm currently telling the central server that the building is on fire. In 3 seconds, the fire suppression system will trigger. The sprinklers? No, Arthur smirked, hitting the enter key. The halon gas. It displaces oxygen in the server room and triggers a hard lock on all electronic doors to prevent ventilation of the flames. Every guard inside is about to be trapped in their respective sectors. A muffled thump echoed from the mill, followed by the hiss of gas. The external floodlights flickered and died. Now, Arthur said, snapping his laptop shut. We have 4 minutes before they manually override the mechanical bolts. Move. They moved through the darkened mill like ghosts. Killian was the blade, clearing hallways with silent, brutal efficiency. Arthur was the brain, using a handheld tablet to flicker the lights in specific rooms to distract guards or triggering false alarms in the East Wing to draw Marco's men away from the holding cells. They reached the central office, the same room where Arthur had first lectured Marco on spinal health. Inside, Marco was pacing, a radio held to his mouth. I don't care if the system is glitching. Find the Vane kid and get him to the van. If the Ice King shows up, shoot on sight. Bad advice, Marco. Killian's voice boomed from the shadows of the doorway. Marco spun, raising his gun, but Arthur had already tapped into the room's smart lighting. A blinding $10,000 lumen strobe effect erupted from the ceiling, disorienting Marco. In the half-second of blindness, Killian closed the distance. He disarmed Marco with a sickening crack of bone and pinned him against the glass wall of the office. You thought I was soft? Killian hissed, the serrated knife from the basement now resting against Marco's throat. I wasn't becoming soft. I was becoming profitable. You just threw away a pension plan and a legitimate life for a power grab you weren't smart enough to pull off. Arthur stepped into the light, looking at his former security lead with nothing but cold disappointment. You're fired, Marco. Effective immediately. Your severance package is a one-way trip to the precinct. Where's Julian? Killian growled, pressing the knife harder. The cold storage, Marco wheezed. He wouldn't stop talking about his sourdough starter. We put him in the fridge to shut him up. Arthur's face went pale. The industrial freezer? He didn't wait for an answer. He sprinted toward the back of the facility, Killian right on his heels. They tore open the heavy insulated door to the walk-in cooler. There, sitting on a crate of frozen spinach and wrapped in a Moretti Shield tactical jacket that was 3 sizes too big for him, was Julian. He was shivering, but he was alive, and he was currently using a Sharpie to draw a diagram on a frozen side of beef. Artie, Julian chirped, his teeth chattering. Did you know that the thermal distribution in this freezer is completely uneven? If you move the fan 6 inches, you'd save $20 per cent dollar on your electric bill. Arthur let out a breath he didn't know he was holding and slumped against the doorframe. Julian, please, just once. Be a normal victim. Killian stepped in, looking at the brothers, the genius and the madman, and felt a wave of fierce, protective heat. He looked at Arthur, and for the first time, there was no Ice King mask. There was just a man who had almost lost his world. Get him to the car, Killian said softly. I'll finish the exit interviews with the rest of the traitors. Arthur nodded, helping Julian up. Killian? The dome paused, his hand on the freezer door. Don't be too efficient, Arthur said, his eyes flashing with a hint of his old ruthlessness. I want them to remember why they were afraid of the butcher before they met the CEO. Chapter 13. The exit interviews had been thorough. By midnight, the dissenters within Moretti's Shield were either in zip ties or had fled the city. But as the adrenaline of the mutiny faded, a chilling silence settled over the docks. Julian is safe at the safe house with David, Arthur said, checking his watch as they walked toward Killian's black SUV. The board has been silenced with a confidential settlement regarding the gala incident. "We've neutralized Marco. We should be in the clear." Killian didn't answer. He was staring at the puddle of oil on the asphalt, his hand hovering over the grip of his sidearm. "What is it?" Arthur asked, his CEO instincts flinching. "The silence," Killian whispered. Marco was a traitor, but he wasn't a mastermind. He didn't have the resources to bypass your geofence. Someone fed him the codes. Before Arthur could process the implication, a high-pitched whine sliced through the air, the sound of a drone. Seconds later, the SUV exploded. The blast threw them both backward. Arthur's world turned into a chaotic blur of orange fire and ringing ears. He felt a heavy weight drag him behind a concrete pillar, just as a hail of gunfire chewed through the air where he had been lying. "Arthur! Look at me!" Killian was shouting, his face streaked with soot and blood from a shallow shrapnel wound. "It's not a coup. It's a liquidation." Through the smoke, 3 matte black vans screeched into the shipyard. These weren't Moretti's men, and they weren't the Volkov's usual street thugs. They moved with military precision, wearing high-end night vision and carrying suppressed rifles. "The Volkov's silent partners," Arthur gasped, clutching his side. "The Vane board of directors. They didn't want a settlement. They wanted a life insurance payout and a clean slate. They're not here to talk," Killian said, returning fire with a grim, rhythmic precision. "They're here to erase the evidence. Both of us." For the first time since the kidnapping in the garage, Arthur felt the cold finger of true mortality. This wasn't a business negotiation or a power struggle he could solve with a spreadsheet. This was a black swan, the unpredictable, catastrophic event that destroys systems. "Killian, go," Arthur panted. "They want the CEO. If I surrender, you can." Killian grabbed Arthur by the lapels of his ruined tuxedo, pulling him so close their foreheads touched. "Listen to me, you arrogant, beautiful idiot. I didn't kidnap you just to let a bunch of corporate suits put a bullet in you. You're the Ice King. Start acting like it." Killian shoved a spare magazine into Arthur's hand and pointed toward the crane assembly. "The crane's control box is networked. If you can get to it and drop the shipping containers, you create a choke point. I'll draw their fire. That's a suicide mission for the decoy," Arthur argued. "I'm not the decoy," Killian smirked, a bloody, terrifyingly beautiful sight. "I'm the butcher. Now move." Arthur ran. He didn't look back. He scrambled up the rusted ladder of the crane, his lungs burning. Below, he heard the roar of Killian's weapon and the answering screams of the mercenaries. He reached the control box, his fingers trembling as he bypassed the manual lock. He didn't just drop the containers. He used the crane's automated logic to swing a 5-ton steel box like a pendulum. The impact was deafening. The crane's arm swept through the mercenary line, crushing 2 of the vans and sending the 3rd into the harbor. Arthur looked down, searching for the dark silhouette of the man he had come to, something. The smoke was clearing. Killian was standing in the center of the wreckage, his shirt torn, his breathing ragged. He looked up at Arthur on the high crane platform and raised a blood-stained hand in a mock salute. But the victory was short-lived. A red laser dot appeared on Killian's chest. "Killian!" Arthur screamed. A single shot rang out, not from the mercenaries, but from the shadows of the warehouse roof. Arthur watched as Killian crumpled to the ground. Chapter 14. The world slowed to a crawl. Arthur didn't think. He reacted. He didn't climb down the ladder. He slid, the metal searing his palms. He reached the ground as a second shot pinged off the concrete inches from his head. "Killian." Arthur skidded to his knees beside the fallen Don. Killian was clutching his shoulder, his breath coming in sharp, shallow stabs. The bullet had caught him just above the heart. "The roof," Killian wheezed, his hand feebly reaching for his fallen handgun. "The sniper." Arthur didn't pick up the gun. He picked up his phone. His face was a mask of glacial fury. He didn't call the police. He didn't call an ambulance. He opened the Vane Enterprises global internal network and initiated a Level 9 security breach. "This is Arthur Vane," he said into the phone, his voice echoing in the hollow shipyard. "Authorization code, Icarus. Trigger the thermal countermeasures on the north docks. Now." High above, the shipyard's automated security towers, the ones Arthur had convinced the board to install for logistics protection, worked to life. Infrared beams swept the rooftops. A moment later, the non-lethal sonic deterrents Arthur had secretly upgraded to high-intensity pulses let out a bone-shaking hum. On the roof, the sniper collapsed, clutching his ears as his equilibrium shattered. Arthur turned back to Killian. He ripped off his own silk tie and used it as a tourniquet, his hand steady despite the chaos. "You are not dying today, Killian. I haven't finished your quarterly review. You and your damn reviews." Killian managed a ghost of a smile before his eyes fluttered shut. The board members were sitting in emergency session. They were already discussing succession plans and tragedy-driven stock rebounds. The double doors didn't just open. They were kicked off their hinges. Arthur Vane walked in. He was covered in soot. His shirt was stained with Killian's blood, and he was carrying a heavy black case. Behind him stood David and a dozen men in Moretti shield uniforms, the ones who had remained loyal. "Arthur?" The chairman stood up, his face a mask of fake relief. "We heard there was an accident at the docks." You were just voting on who gets my chair," Arthur interrupted, slamming the black case onto the mahogany table. He opened it to reveal a laptop and a stack of physical documents. Mikhail Volkov's ledger wasn't just bank accounts. It was a communication log. It turns out the silent partners in the Russian mob were three of you. He turned the laptop screen toward them. It showed the wire transfers from the board's offshore shell companies to the mercenaries at the docks. "This is a hostile takeover," Arthur said, leaning over the table, his eyes burning with a terrifying light. "But not the kind you're used to. David, take them. The FBI's waiting in the lobby with the evidence I've already uploaded to every major news outlet in the hemisphere." As the board members were dragged out in a flurry of protests and handcuffs, Arthur sank into his leather chair. He was exhausted. He was bleeding. He was alone. His phone buzzed. It was a text from a secure medical facility. Arthur let out a long, shaky breath. He stood up, ignored the ringing phones and the flashing stock tickers on the wall, and walked out. "Where are you going, sir?" David asked, stepping into the hall. "The press is outside. The company is in free fall." "The company can wait," Arthur said, straightening his blood-stained cuffs. "I have a merger to finalize." Chapter 15. The private wing of St. Jude's Medical Center was quieter than a library and twice as expensive. Arthur walked through the halls, his stride regaining its usual rhythmic clip, though he had finally changed into a fresh suit, a charcoal wool that felt like a secondary skin. He pushed open the door to room 502. Killian was sitting up in bed, his chest wrapped in thick bandages, looking remarkably like a caged panther. He was holding a plastic cup of brown liquid with a look of profound betrayal. "I'm going to burn this building down," Killian rasped as Arthur entered. "The nurse told me this was premium roast. It's lukewarm dirt, Arthur." Arthur didn't say a word. He walked to the bedside table, set down a sleek brushed metal thermos, and poured a cup of dark, aromatic coffee. The scent of high-altitude Colombian beans filled the sterile room. Killian took a sip, closed his eyes, and exhaled a breath that sounded like a prayer. "Okay, I won't burn it down. For now." Arthur sat in the chair beside the bed, crossing his legs. He looked at Killian, really looked at him beyond the tattoos and the scars. The board is gone. The Volkovs are a memory. Vane Enterprises is currently undergoing a leadership transition that the press is calling a miracle of corporate resilience. "And the butcher?" Killian asked, his dark eyes searching Arthur's. "What's the market value of a mob boss who's currently a ward of the state?" Arthur reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a single sheet of heavy cream vellum. He laid it on Killian's lap. "This is the new charter for Vane Moretti Global," Arthur said, his voice steady. "It's a dual-entity partnership. You handle the logistics, the parts of the world that don't respond to emails. I handle the capital. We don't just protect assets anymore, Killian. We build them." Killian looked at the document, then back at Arthur. "You put my name on the letterhead, next to yours." "It's a strategic alignment," Arthur said, though his hand drifted toward the bed, his fingers grazing Killian's uninjured arm. "And I find I've grown accustomed to having someone around who critiques my security protocols." Killian grabbed Arthur's hand, his grip surprisingly strong for a man who had been shot 12 hours ago. He pulled Arthur forward until the CEO was leaning over the hospital bed, their faces inches apart. "You're a high-maintenance partner, Ice King," Killian whispered, his thumb tracing the line of Arthur's jaw. "The paperwork is a nightmare. The coffee expectations are unrealistic. And your brother keeps texting me recipes for gluten-free scones. And yet," Arthur breathed, a small, genuine smile breaking through his professional mask, "you haven't signed the exit agreement." "I tore it up," Killian said. He reached up, his hand tangling in Arthur's perfectly styled hair, and pulled him down into a kiss that tasted like coffee and victory. It wasn't a kidnapping anymore. It was an acquisition. 6 months later, the silver Maybach pulled up to a sleek, unmarked skyscraper in the heart of the city. Arthur stepped out, followed by Killian, who was wearing a suit that cost more than a small villa and carrying a briefcase that contained nothing but a very expensive handgun and a laptop. As they entered the lobby, the security guards, a mix of former Mossad and former Moretti enforcers, snapped to attention. "Sir," Marco, the new, actually loyal Marco, said, nodding to them both. "The 9 a.m. meeting is ready. Julian is in the break room. He's trying to convince the tactical team that probiotics are the key to better aim." Arthur sighed, looking at Killian. "We should have left him in the freezer." Killian laughed, throwing an arm around Arthur's shoulders as they stepped into the private elevator. "Too late for that, boss. He's part of the overhead now." As the elevator ascended toward the penthouse, Arthur caught their reflection in the mirrored walls. They looked like a matched set, the predator in the boardroom and the predator in the streets, finally moving in the same direction. Arthur adjusted Killian's tie, his fingers lingering on the crow's wing tattoo. "Ready for the quarterly review?" Killian smirked, the light of the rising sun hitting the glass as they reached the top floor. "Arthur, I was born ready." The doors opened, and the world waited.